Deep in the Barents Sea, where the water turns black and the pressure can crush steel, something has been waiting in the darkness for decades. A Cold War submarine locked in ice-cold depths, sitting on the ocean floor like a tomb that nobody dared to open. But in the winter of 2024, scientists did something that maritime experts said was impossible. They raised the nuclear submarine from the seafloor, and when they finally cracked open the sealed compartments, what they found inside rewrote everything we thought we knew about the disaster that killed an entire crew. The story begins on a day that started like any other in August, a day when the sky was clear and the ocean seemed calm. Nobody on the surface realized that down below, in the crushing darkness at 350 feet, a disaster was unfolding that would become one of the deadliest submarine accidents in history. The submarine was called the Kursk, and it was no ordinary vessel. This was a monster of the deep, a nuclear-powered attack submarine designed to hunt American aircraft carriers and strike them with cruise missiles that could level cities. The Kursk was one of the biggest submarines ever built by the Soviet Union, part of the Oscar II class, a line of submarines so massive that each one weighed nearly 20,000 tons when fully submerged. To put that in perspective, that's about twice the weight of a large military destroyer squeezed into a steel tube that was over 500 feet long. Inside that tube lived 118 sailors, packed into compartments so tight that a man could barely stretch his arms without bumping a wall. The Kursk was armed with enough firepower to change the course of a war. 24 of the Granite cruise missiles hung beneath its outer hull, each one 33 feet long and weighing several tons. These weren't just any missiles. They were designed to fly hundreds of miles at tremendous speed, fast enough to intercept and destroy a moving aircraft carrier. Each missile could carry either a massive conventional warhead or a nuclear warhead, and they were built to be fired in patterns so they could coordinate their attacks and pick out the most valuable target in a naval formation. On top of all that devastating firepower, the submarine's bow held 8 torpedo tubes. 4 of them were standard size, meant for regular torpedoes. But 4 others were specially designed to fire the heaviest weapons the Soviet Navy possessed, anti-ship torpedoes built to kill a large warship with a single impact. Those tubes could also fire rocket-powered missiles, either anti-ship or anti-submarine variants. And officially, every single one of those weapons could be fitted with a nuclear warhead if the commanders decided they needed it. But by the year 2000, the Navy that operated this lethal machine was in crisis. After the Soviet Union collapsed at the end of the Cold War, Russia's Northern Fleet lost nearly everything that kept it functional. The money dried up, the trained personnel scattered, the fuel became scarce. Submarines that had been the pride of the fleet were suddenly tied to piers and left to rust. Some days, sailors didn't even receive their paychecks. The amount of time crews spent training at sea dropped dramatically, which meant the men who operated these complex weapon systems had fewer chances to practice their skills with real equipment. Even in that desperate situation, the commanders of the Northern Fleet still wanted to prove that Russia was a serious naval power, capable of operating far from home and projecting force across the world's oceans. So in August of the year 2000, they scheduled a massive naval exercise in the Barents Sea. They called it Summer X, and it was supposed to be the biggest show of Soviet power since the Cold War had ended. More than 50 ships and submarines were supposed to participate. 40 support vessels would be on standby. 80 aircraft and helicopters would fill the skies. And at the center of it all was the Kursk, crewed by sailors who had recently been praised as the best in the entire fleet. The exercise was supposed to be just a drill, a training operation, but there was one crucial detail that made it different from normal exercises. The Kursk was allowed to carry live weapons, real cruise missiles. Real torpedoes, not dummy rounds, not simulations, the actual weapons of war, fully armed and ready to be fired. It was one of the few submarines in the fleet that was trusted enough to carry combat weapons even during peacetime exercises. On the first day of the exercise, the Kursk proved why that trust was placed in it. The submarine fired one of its Granite cruise missiles during a test, and the shot went perfectly. The missile launched as designed, performed flawlessly, and the test was declared a success. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. After that successful test, the exercise moved into its next phase. The Kursk was ordered to move to a new position in the Barents Sea, about 85 miles from the fleet's main base. At that position, the submarine was supposed to conduct what should have been a routine practice firing. The target was a decommissioned battlecruiser called the Pyotr Veliki, the flagship of the Northern Fleet. The weapon chosen for this practice shot was a Type 65K heavy torpedo, more than 30 feet long, and designed to lock onto the wake of a large ship and follow it even if the target tried to maneuver. But this particular torpedo was different from the standard models. It was powered by high test peroxide, a very concentrated form of hydrogen peroxide. The Soviet Navy had chosen this fuel because it gave the torpedo exceptional speed and range, allowing it to chase down and hit fast-moving targets like aircraft carriers. Other navies had stopped using this kind of fuel years earlier because they understood something that the Soviets either ignored or didn't know. High test peroxide is unstable. It's dangerous. If it leaks from its containment and touches certain metals or dirt inside a confined space, it decomposes almost instantly. When it does, it explodes. It expands thousands of times its original volume in a fraction of a second, creating a pressure wave and heat that turns whatever container holds it into a bomb. The torpedo that was loaded into the Kursk's forward torpedo tube on August 12th was one of these high-test peroxide weapons. But this particular torpedo had a flaw that nobody had caught during maintenance. There was a faulty weld in the torpedo's casing, a hairline crack that ran along the metal. That crack was tiny, almost invisible to the naked eye, but it was enough. High-test peroxide began to seep out of the casing, leaking into spaces where it should never have been. When that leaking liquid came into contact with certain metals inside the confined space of the torpedo tube, metals that acted as a catalyst, the chemical reaction began. The peroxide broke down. Oxygen and hot steam poured from the decomposing chemical. That oxygen mixed with kerosene fuel inside the torpedo engine, and they ignited. Pressure built inside the torpedo's fuel tanks faster than the metal could contain it. The kerosene tanks ruptured, and in an instant, the torpedo became a bomb, a massive explosion waiting to happen. Just before 11 in the morning on August 12th, 2,000 sensors all across Northern Europe picked up a vibration through the Earth. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but it was there. Seismographs recorded a small underwater explosion in the Barents Sea. On the scale used to measure earthquakes, it registered about 2.2 in magnitude. That might not sound like much, but it was equivalent to between 100 and a few hundred pounds of TNT detonating underwater. That was the first explosion inside the forward torpedo room of the Kursk. The force blew off the inner and outer doors of the torpedo tube. It tore through the first compartment. It started a fire that spread into the second compartment through a ventilation duct. Everyone who was in those forward compartments died in an instant or within the first few seconds. The force of the explosion was so sudden and so overwhelming that there was no time to react, no time to reach for emergency equipment, no time to escape. But inside the control room and in the compartments further back in the submarine, the sailors felt the impact. A massive kick ran through the entire vessel. Lights shook. Equipment rattled loose from its moorings. Alarms began to sound. Harsh red lights that meant emergency conditions, flickered on across every panel. The nose of the submarine began to flood as seawater poured in through the damaged sections. The situation was catastrophic, but it was about to get much worse. The heat and flames from the initial explosion spread backward through the torpedo room, cooking off the other weapons that were stored there. Several torpedo warheads, each one containing explosives designed to sink a major warship, started to detonate almost simultaneously. Between 5 and 7 of these warheads exploded in rapid succession, and this was not a contained blast like the first explosion. This was a catastrophic secondary detonation. The seismic sensors on the surface measured this blast at 4.2 on the earthquake scale. That meant it was roughly 2 to 3 tons of TNT detonating in a confined space. The explosion was more than 200 times more powerful than the first one. That second massive blast tore open a huge section of the Kursk's bow. It crushed the bulkheads, those thick steel walls designed to prevent flooding from spreading. It collapsed the first 3 compartments of the submarine. The force was so intense that a large chunk of the submarine's nose was driven backward, leaving a terrifying hole in the front of the double hull. The entire forward part of the submarine drove into the soft seabed below. But somehow, remarkably, the rest of the pressure hull held together. The nuclear reactors, housed in special compartments designed to survive almost any damage, shut down automatically, just as they had been engineered to do in an emergency. And the compartments in the middle and rear sections of the submarine remained mostly watertight. The wreck settled on the bottom of the Barents Sea at a depth of about 108 meters, or roughly 350 feet. On the surface, nearby ships felt the shocks from the underwater blasts. Some crew members heard strange sounds or noticed the vibrations. But in the confusion and the ongoing exercise, no one at first understood that a frontline nuclear submarine had just suffered a catastrophic explosion and sunk to the ocean floor. The commanders at the Northern Fleet base believed the exercise was still proceeding normally. It took until early evening for them to realize that something was terribly wrong. The Kursk had failed to respond to radio calls. Underwater telephone signals went unanswered. After trying to make contact several times without success, the Navy finally declared an emergency and launched a formal search operation. But by that time, more than 6 hours had passed since the first explosion. Rescue ships and aircraft began to sweep the exercise area, and in the early hours of the next morning, a specialist vessel equipped with deep diving equipment finally reached what they believed was the position of the wreck. They lowered a small rescue submarine down into the darkness to search the seafloor. That rescue minisub actually bumped into Kursk's stern section once, damaging itself in the process, and had to be brought back to the surface for repairs. Another rescue craft was sent out, but it was given the wrong coordinates and missed the wreck entirely, wasting more precious hours. Meanwhile, back at the home base, where families of the crew lived, word began to spread that something had happened. The Navy told relatives almost nothing. Early public statements said only that the submarine had descended to the ocean floor due to technical difficulties and that all crew members were still alive. It was a lie. The official statements kept insisting that everyone on the Kursk was safe, that rescue was on the way, that there was no cause for alarm. Families clung to those words, hoping against hope that their sons and husbands would be brought back safely. The days that followed were a disaster of incompetence and denial. The main Russian rescue submarine, a vessel called the AS-34, tried again and again to latch onto the escape hatch over the Kursk's rear compartment, but it couldn't get a proper seal. Bad weather rolled in, bringing strong currents and heavy seas that made the operation even more difficult. Equipment malfunctions and failures kept interrupting the rescue attempts. More time passed. The public pressure grew, and around the world, other nations began to offer help. The United States offered advanced rescue equipment. Britain sent specialized personnel. Norway, sitting just across the sea from where the Kursk lay, offered their most modern rescue systems and experienced deep-sea divers. For several days, Russian leaders refused the assistance. They insisted they had the situation under control. They said that accepting foreign help would be a blow to national pride. President Vladimir Putin, who was still relatively new to his position as leader of Russia, came under heavy criticism when it was revealed that he had stayed on holiday at a Black Sea resort even as the crisis unfolded. He didn't return to Moscow immediately. He didn't take direct command of the rescue effort. That lack of leadership at the highest level would haunt him for the rest of his presidency. Only on the fifth day after the disaster, after it became clear that Russian rescue efforts alone could not save anyone, did the government finally agree to accept foreign help. A Norwegian ship carrying a modern rescue submarine and teams of experienced deep-sea divers arrived at the wreck site. By the time these foreign teams managed to attach their equipment to the stern escape hatch and finally open it, more than a week had passed since the Kursk sank to the bottom. When they looked inside the escape compartment, they found it was completely flooded. There were no survivors. All 118 men aboard the Kursk were dead. The submarine became a sealed tomb, lying in the shallow water off Russia's north coast. For more than a year, it remained there, sitting in the darkness, untouched, while the government and various agencies argued about what to do with it. The Russian government faced a difficult choice. They could leave the Kursk on the seafloor, where it had settled. After all, it was only at 350 feet, not in the deepest part of the ocean. But leaving it there would mean accepting a massive public relations disaster. Families wanted their relatives' remains brought home for proper burial. Journalists kept asking hard questions about why a submarine in such shallow water had been abandoned for so long. Environmental groups worried about radiation leaking from the damaged reactor. The pressure on the government was intense. Officials promised that they would not leave the boat on the seafloor. They would raise the hull, no matter how difficult or expensive it turned out to be. For the Kremlin, it was about more than just recovering bodies. It was about the reputation of the state. The Navy had already been blamed for the slow rescue. Now Moscow needed to show the world that it could do something bold, something that required advanced technology and international cooperation. They needed to succeed where previous rescue efforts had failed. There was a major problem with this plan. Russia didn't have the equipment or the money to do it alone. The wreck weighed well over 18,000 tons. It was sitting at a depth of 350 feet on a soft seabed. The country's own heavy-lift ships and rescue systems were worn out after years of low funding during the difficult 1,990 seconds. So the government reached out to Western companies that specialized in recovering large objects from the sea. In May of 2001, Russia signed a contract with a Dutch company called Mammoet, which was one of the world's experts in heavy lifting operations, and a salvage company called Smid International. Together, these two firms formed a joint team to plan and execute the recovery. The cost was enormous by Russian standards at that time. Early estimates said that it would cost about $70 million. Russia even appealed to some European countries to help cover the bill. Later reports from officials and media outlets said the final cost ended up being around $65 million. Either way, it became one of the most expensive salvage operations in history, done under intense time pressure in rough northern waters, and with the entire world watching to see if it would succeed or fail. From the very beginning, the engineers at Mammoet and Smid knew this was not a typical wreck recovery. The submarine still contained 2 active nuclear reactors, a full set of cruise missiles, and several torpedoes that hadn't been accounted for. Official statements from the Russian Navy kept changing. At first, military officials insisted there were no unexploded weapons left inside the submarine. Later, they admitted that some torpedoes might still be sitting in the wreck. That uncertainty was dangerous because any serious shock or mistake during the lifting operation could set off another explosion or damage the reactor compartments. Environmental groups and safety organizations like Bellona warned that if something went wrong during the lift, the Barents Sea could be contaminated by spilled reactor fuel or a detonation of remaining warheads. To make matters worse, the submarine had suffered massive damage to its bow section. The first and second compartments had been completely destroyed by the explosions. Much of the first three compartments had collapsed. The hull was twisted and torn in ways that made any kind of recovery operation extraordinarily risky. The engineering challenge was unlike anything Mammoet had tackled before. Imagine trying to lift a steel tube longer than a football field, weighing 18,000 tons, from the bottom of the sea while lying on soft mud and clay. You can't simply wrap cables around it and pull. The outer shell isn't strong enough to handle that kind of force. If the cables are attached in the wrong places, the hull will tear open. It could twist. It might even snap in the middle. If any of that happened, 2 damaged nuclear reactors would spill into the ocean. Loose missiles and torpedoes would scatter on the seafloor. Human remains would be scattered everywhere. The team needed a plan that would treat the submarine like one single, solid package that could be lifted straight up in a controlled, measured way. That meant distributing the massive weight evenly across multiple lifting points, making sure no single part of the hull was bearing more load than it could handle. There was another critical problem. The explosion had completely destroyed the Kursk's torpedo room and the inner pressure hull in the bow. Investigators believed that several warheads and parts of the torpedoes were still buried in the twisted metal of the destroyed sections. If the team tried to lift the entire submarine with that damaged section still attached, the wrecked bow could break off halfway up. That would unbalance the entire load, risk snapping what remained of the hull, and potentially detonate any unstable explosives that were still trapped inside the wreckage. So, Mammoet made a difficult decision. The bow section would be left on the bottom of the sea. Only the aft section, the rear 2/3 of the submarine that still contained the reactors, most of the missiles, the crew compartments, and the engine room would be raised. The damaged bow would remain where it was, still holding its deadly secrets. To separate the bow from the rest of the submarine, the team couldn't use simple cutting tools. They needed to make a straight, clean, cut-through thick steel that had already been bent and torn by the explosions. The problem was working in absolute darkness, at 350 feet underwater, with a wreck that might shift slightly under the divers as they worked. The solution was ingenious. The team installed 2 giant suction anchors directly into the seabed, one on each side of the submarine's hull. A suction anchor is a large, hollow cylinder of steel that is pushed down into the soft seafloor and then sealed in place. Water pressure helps hold it against the bottom, much like a cup sticking to a smooth surface. Between these 2 anchors, the team strung a special abrasive cable saw. It wasn't a thin wire, it was a thick steel rope fitted with hard metal sleeves that were coated in grinding grit. Industrial winches on the anchors pulled the cable back and forth, over and over, like a giant wire saw, slowly chewing through the damaged bow section. The work was done by divers and remote-operated tools working in absolute darkness, with seawater so cold it was nearly freezing, always aware that they were working just a few feet away from a wreck full of unexploded explosives and highly radioactive nuclear material. While the cutting teams worked on separating the bow, engineers back on shore and on the support ships focused on the next step of the operation: They needed to turn the remaining section of the submarine into something they could actually grab and lift without tearing it apart. They chose a massive platform called Giant 4, which was a semi-submersible barge. A semi-submersible barge is basically a flat, heavy deck structure that can be lowered deep into the water by flooding compartments inside it and then raised again by pumping that water back out. This design allows the barge to work in rough seas because the deck stays stable above the waves, while the submerged portions can flex and move with the currents. Mammoet completely refitted Giant 4 for this operation. They arranged it so the submarine would hang suspended underneath the barge's center rather than being placed on top. On the deck above, they installed 26 heavy lifting devices called strand jacks. A strand jack is basically a powerful winch that works by pulling a bundle of thick steel cables upward just a few inches at a time using hydraulic pressure. After lifting those cables a few inches, mechanical clamps lock them in place, preventing them from slipping backward. Then the process repeats. The cables are pulled up a few more inches, locked again, and the cycle continues. Each of the 26 strand jacks on Giant 4 was individually rated to lift about 900 tons. All of them were connected to a computer system that would control them together, distributing the load equally to prevent any single cable or jack from bearing too much weight. To connect those strand jacks to the submarine itself, divers had to drill and cut a pattern of holes into the hull. The submarine had 2 layers of steel, an outer shell, and a much stronger inner pressure hull that actually kept the water out when the boat was operating at depth. The team used high-pressure water jets and other specialized tools to cut 26 openings through both layers of steel at carefully chosen positions along the length of the wreck. Around each hole, they installed a guide ring to keep the cables aligned. Later, workers would lower special steel devices called grippers down through those rings. Each gripper worked like a toggle bolt that you might use to hang a picture on drywall. It would slide through the hole in a narrow configuration, then expand and lock on the inside of the pressure hull. That way, when the lifting cables pulled upward, the load would be distributed directly into the strongest part of the submarine's structure, not into the thin outer skin that could tear easily. The divers who did this incredibly dangerous work didn't go up and down to the surface in a normal way. That would have been impossible to do safely at 350 feet. Instead, they lived in special pressurized chambers on a support ship called DS&D Mayo. This method, known as saturation diving, allows divers to stay under pressure for weeks at a time. They would spend about 6 hours on the seafloor performing their tasks, breathing compressed air that matched the pressure of the water around them. Then they would return to the pressurized chamber without having to undergo the slow decompression process that would normally take days or weeks. By living under pressure continuously, they could decompress once at the end of the entire operation, rather than decompressing after every single dive. By late summer of 2001, nearly 14 months after the Kursk sank, everything was finally in place. Giant 4 and the support ships were positioned directly over the wreck site. The bow section had been completely separated from the rest of the submarine and would remain on the seafloor. The 26 openings had been drilled through the hull. The grippers and cables were installed and ready. The barge was held in position by an 8-point mooring system, meaning 8 heavy anchors connected to powerful winches that pulled the barge from different directions to keep it fixed over the submarine. All that remained was the lift itself. The moment had come to attempt something that many people said was impossible: to raise a nuclear submarine from the ocean floor without disaster. In early October, the team began tightening the cables. Slowly, over many hours, the 26 strand jacks pulled tension onto the lifting cables. The weight of the submarine began to shift. The grip of the mud and clay on the hull started to break. Thousands of tons of upward force pressed against the structure. The engineers watched every gauge and every sensor continuously. They were ready to stop the lift immediately if any reading looked wrong. Radiation monitors were checked constantly to make sure the reactor section hadn't been damaged by the process. The readings stayed at normal background levels, a good sign that the reactor compartment had held together through all the shaking and shifting. After roughly 15 hours of continuous lifting, the main aft section of the Kursk was finally hanging suspended beneath Giant 4, dangling in the water like a massive piece of refuse being pulled from the depths. The barge then began a slow, carefully controlled trip southward toward the Russian coast. Support ships escorted it, watching for any signs of trouble, monitoring the stability of the load. At a naval yard in Rozlyakovo near the city of Murmansk, workers had prepared one of the world's largest floating dry docks, called PD-50, to receive this strange and deadly cargo. The dock was essentially a massive rectangular container with gates that could be closed and pumped dry. The plan was very controlled and methodical. First, Giant 4, with the Kursk hanging underneath, was carefully maneuvered into the flooded dry dock. Then workers attached extra floating tanks called pontoons so the whole structure could rise together as one. Once everything was ready and positioned correctly, the gates of the dry dock were sealed closed. Powerful pumps began removing the water from inside the dock. As the water level dropped, the Kursk and Giant 4 slowly settled onto keel blocks and support structures at the bottom. Only when the submarine was safely resting on these supports, no longer hanging by cables, did the crews begin to release the lifting cables and remove the grippers from the holes in the hull. For the first time in over a year, the Kursk was no longer a shadow on a sonar screen, no longer an image on a computer monitor in a control room thousands of miles away. The submarine was now visible to human eyes, sitting in the open air inside a massive concrete and steel box illuminated by bright work lights. The black paint of the hull was scarred and damaged from the lift. The damaged bow section was noticeably missing. The entire forward part of the submarine showed the terrible scars of the explosions. But the aft section, the rear two-thirds of the boat, had made it through the operation intact. Military doctors and forensic investigators set up a temporary laboratory at a nearby naval hospital in Severomorsk to handle whatever would be brought out from inside the hull. That lab would process equipment, weapons, documents, and the remains of the 118 men who had died in the disaster. But even now, with the submarine in dry dock and all the water drained away from the exterior, almost all of the interior compartments remained sealed. No human had stepped through those hatches since the day the crew died. Those compartments were still dark inside, still filled with whatever had been left behind when the submarine sank. The water that had flooded some sections had eventually settled. The air that had been trapped in other sections had remained sealed for all these months. Scientists and investigators understood that opening those compartments would reveal the final hours of the Kursk, the last moments of the men who survived the explosion. But nobody knew what they would actually find inside. The opening of the sealed compartments began with the sections that had taken the heaviest damage, the forward areas where the explosions had occurred. Teams of workers began cutting new holes into the hull and working their way methodically through the thick bulkheads, those heavy steel walls that divided the submarine into separate sealed rooms. In the old command spaces near the front of the boat, metal panels were peeled back carefully, like opening the lid of a can. In some parts of the torpedo room and the neighboring compartments, there were hardly any flat surfaces left. Everything was warped and twisted. Steel frames were bent into loops and spirals. Pipes were snapped and twisted like taffy. Lockers were crushed against the walls into useless masses of metal. Military doctors who examined what was left of the bodies in those front compartments later said that some of the crew members in those spaces had died under forces equivalent to more than 50 times normal gravity. That kind of pressure kills instantly. There is no pain, no suffering that lasts more than a fraction of a second. The force is so overwhelming that death comes before the brain can even process what has happened. The investigation of the forward compartments told a simple but devastating story. Everyone who was in those first sections when the torpedoes exploded died immediately. There was no suffering that lasted. There was no time for fear or desperation. But further back in the submarine, the story was dramatically different. The thick bulkheads and special shielding that protected the reactor compartment had held firm against the blast wave. Doors had been closed in the rear sections of the submarine. Some rooms had remained dry, at least initially. When the hull was finally opened in the dry dock and water was pumped out, those rear compartments were found to still be full of air. They contained soot from fires, they contained the twisted remains of equipment, and they contained evidence of what the surviving crew had done during their final hours, especially in one critical section at the very back of the submarine. That compartment was called Compartment 9, and it was the turbine room, located near the stern of the boat. It had an escape hatch in its ceiling. When Russian and Norwegian divers had reached this compartment while the wreck was still on the seabed, working in absolute darkness and zero visibility, they had felt their way through black water and silt. They had found bodies and some scattered documents. But only after the hull was brought into the dry dock and the water was drained away could investigators finally see the complete picture of what had actually happened in that space. The reports from inside Compartment 9 describe a place that had been under tremendous stress and suffering. The walls and the ceiling were dark with soot, stained black by smoke from fires that had raged through the submarine after the explosion. Electrical wiring was burned. Insulation was charred and broken. There were marks on the metal where flames had licked along the upper part of the room, leaving dark traces of their passage. Lower down on the bulkheads, the thick steel walls, there were clear lines that marked how high water had risen at one point. The water level had climbed to about a person's waist height. That meant the men in Compartment 9 had been standing in cold seawater, mixed with oil from the submarine's systems, breathing air that was filled with smoke and dust while they fought desperately to stay alive. 24 sailors had been assigned to the rear compartments of the submarine. After the explosions, 23 of them made it into Compartment 9. They gathered there because it was the only place in the back of the submarine that still had an escape hatch, and it had at least some emergency power. The compartment had emergency lights, and those lights had come on after the explosions and stayed on for a while. That was the crucial detail. They had light. They weren't in total darkness. They could see each other. They could move around. They had a few precious hours to think, to process what had happened, and to try to figure out if there was any way to survive. One of the officers in that compartment was a man named Captain Lieutenant Dmitry Kolesnikov. In those first hours, while they still had light and before the situation became desperate, Kolesnikov sat down with a pencil and a scrap of paper and he wrote something. He wrote a note. That note would be discovered months later, folded carefully in his pocket. The writing was cramped but clear enough to read. On one side of the paper, Kolesnikov wrote a short message to his wife. On the other side, he wrote down what was happening in the compartment. He listed the names of 23 men who had survived the initial explosions and were now in the back of the submarine with him. He also wrote down the time. The first note was marked as 13:15 in the afternoon, which was about 1 hour and 45 minutes after the second, larger blast. The fact that his handwriting was steady and the letters were neat and clear showed that they still had light, they still had some hope, and they still had at least a little time to think rationally about their situation. There was also a second note, written later by Kolesnikov or another officer. This note was much harder to read. The letters were shaky, they weren't as neat, the paper was damp. One line that was made public later said that there were 23 people in the ninth compartment, that they felt very bad, and that they were getting weaker from carbon monoxide that was seeping in after a fire had spread through the submarine. In one sentence, the note also said something that was absolutely devastating. It said that if they tried to reach the surface, the change in pressure would kill them. They were trapped, they were dying, and they knew it. When those notes were shown to the families of the crew and to the public, it hit the country like a second shockwave, just as devastating as the original disaster. For days after the Kursk sank, the Navy had told people that everyone on the submarine probably died within minutes of the explosions. The notes proved that wasn't true. If a proper rescue craft had reached the escape hatch in time and had been able to connect and extract people, some of those men might have been pulled out alive. The military might have saved lives if they had acted faster and accepted foreign help sooner. But instead, those 23 men spent their final hours in the dark, knowing they were going to die, with no rescue coming. Inside compartment 9, investigators found the tools that the men had tried to use to keep themselves alive. One of the most important was a device called an oxygen cartridge. The type carried by the Kursk used a chemical called potassium superoxide. Each cartridge is basically a block of chemicals that does two critical things at once. It absorbs carbon dioxide from the air and releases fresh oxygen to replace what the men were breathing. These cartridges are designed to be used when they're completely dry. But if they get wet, especially if they're immersed in dirty seawater that's mixed with oil from the submarine systems, they react very quickly. That reaction is violent, they can explode. The investigation found that compartment 9 was filled with oxygen cartridges. Many of them had been used normally, consumed to keep the air breathable as the men waited. But there were still many unused cartridges scattered around the compartment. At some point, as the situation became more desperate and the air quality deteriorated, one of the men tried to activate or move a cartridge on the floor, but it slipped from his hands. It fell into the mix of seawater and oil that had collected on the bottom of the compartment. The chemicals reacted instantly with the contaminated water. There was a sudden, violent explosion. There was a flash fire, a burst of intense flames that spread through the compartment. The blast and the flames burned through clothing and skin. Doctors who examined the bodies later said that 3 sailors from that compartment showed severe thermal burns and chemical burns. In Kolesnikov's case, the acid from the reaction burned his stomach area so badly that it exposed his internal organs. The skin and tissue on parts of his head and neck were torn away by the blast and the flames. Marks on the metal bulkheads showed that some of the men, in one last desperate move when the cartridge exploded, tried to dive under the water to escape the flames and the heat, trying to protect themselves for just a few more seconds. It didn't work. The blast from the cartridge explosion had used up what little oxygen was left in the compartment. The explosion had filled the air with toxic gases. Those who had survived the burns quickly suffocated in the poisoned air. When divers finally opened the escape hatch from the outside many days later, after the submarine had been on the seabed for over a week, they found only a tiny air pocket remaining near the ceiling of compartment 9. Tests showed the oxygen levels in that remaining air were down around 7%. Normal air has about 21% oxygen. Humans cannot survive for long in air that thin. The men in compartment 9 had slowly suffocated as the situation deteriorated. All through the hull, as compartments were opened and drained in the dry dock, teams of investigators and military doctors began the grim work of collecting the remains. They worked around the clock, carrying stretchers out of the wreck and loading them into waiting vehicles. Stories from that time talk about watches found on swollen wrists, stopped at the exact time of the blasts or later in the day. Wedding rings were carefully removed and bagged. Small photographs were found, folded in pockets, pictures of wives and girlfriends and children. Ship's papers and log pages were pulled from desks and drawers or floating in corners of compartments. Some bodies were still positioned near their duty stations where the men had died at their posts. Other bodies had clearly been moved. The men had tried to reach safer spaces after the explosions, trying to escape the spreading fire and water, trying to find a way out that didn't exist. From the dry dock, all the remains and personal items were transported to the temporary forensic laboratory near the naval base at Severomorsk. There, military doctors and forensic investigators worked carefully through the remains, trying to give names back to the dead. They used dental records, they used medical files, they looked for distinctive scars or tattoos that could help identify individuals. They interviewed families about any distinctive marks or medical conditions that might help with identification. In total, about 94 bodies were recovered from the Kursk and later identified. Some additional body fragments from the dives down to the seabed while the submarine was still on the ocean floor were also catalogued and preserved. A few men could never be fully identified because of the tremendous damage caused by the blasts and by the months underwater, but officials stated that all the bodies they could possibly recover had been brought out of the wreck and given proper treatment. The investigation into what exactly went wrong with the Type 65K torpedo that started the chain reaction would continue for months. The wreckage of that specific torpedo was recovered from the debris, though identifying which individual warhead caused the initial explosion was nearly impossible given how completely the forward section had been destroyed. Russian Navy officials admitted publicly for the first time that they had been using high-test peroxide torpedoes in their fleet for many years, and that there had been previous incidents with these weapons. They revealed that a few years before the Kursk disaster, another submarine had also suffered an explosion from a leaking peroxide torpedo, though in that case, the submarine had managed to survive and limp back to port with damage. That earlier incident should have been a warning signal, a red flag that the entire fleet needed to review its torpedo maintenance procedures and safety protocols. But the warnings had been ignored. The Navy had continued to operate these dangerous weapons without making the necessary changes. The maintenance standards had remained inadequate. The training for handling and storing these torpedoes had not been updated. So, when the Kursk came to its tragic end, it was not because of one isolated failure or one careless mistake. It was because of systemic problems that had been building for years, problems that the military leadership had known about but had chosen to tolerate because updating the entire fleet's procedures would have cost money and time that they didn't feel they had. The discovery of Kolesnikov's notes in the dry dock changed how the entire Russian public understood the disaster. It was no longer an abstract tragedy, a number on a page saying 118 people died. It was now a personal horror, a story about real men with names and faces and families who had spent hours trapped in a sealed metal tube, slowly suffocating while rescue forces fumbled and delayed on the surface. The notes made it impossible for anyone to deny that mistakes had been made in the rescue effort. If a Norwegian or American rescue submarine had been called in immediately, if the military had not wasted those critical first days refusing foreign assistance, if someone had made the decision faster to accept help instead of worrying about national pride, some of those men might have lived. That cold hard truth was written in Kolesnikov's handwriting, in words that his wife and his family would read and reread for the rest of their lives. Dmitry Kolesnikov had been 27 years old. He left behind a wife and 2 young children. His notes became symbols not just of the tragedy, but of the failures of the system that failed to save him and his crew. And that's the incredible true story of the Cold War submarine that scientists managed to raise from the depths, and the shocking discoveries they made when they opened those sealed compartments. If you found this story as fascinating as I did, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because we cover stories like this all the time: incredible underwater discoveries, mysterious shipwrecks, and the amazing engineering feats that bring lost vessels back to the surface. And if you want to stay updated on all our latest videos about marine exploration and Cold War history, turn on the notification bell so you never miss a single upload. Drop a like if you appreciated learning about the Kursk submarine and what happened to its crew. And most importantly, let me know in the comments below what other Cold War military mysteries or underwater discoveries you'd like us to investigate next. There are countless stories still waiting to be uncovered from the depths of the ocean, and with your support, we'll be able to bring those stories to you. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.